G'day, Nick here, Animal Engineering. Welcome back to the channel. In this episode we are going to be getting the Commodore shell onto the table and we'll start using it to pull a jig off. As you can see, I've been and stripped the car. Still a few bits there left to sell. I've sold a few bits already, which has been pretty damn good. You can see I've moved the table around just so it's a bit easier to get to with the forklift and everything. And I've got my first pieces lined up on the table here. So I've sort of measured in between the two sills. It's 1540. So the table's 1500 wide, so I've set these little top blocks an extra 20mm each side. So we should be able to land it and get it pretty central to the table straight away, hopefully. So we'll get it on the table and then I'll run through what I've got going on my head. You want to know what's going on in my head? Alright, well there you go, that is on the table. I did have to open it up 1/4 of an inch. I was slightly off, a bit hard trying to hold the tape measure upside down under there, but it's good, it's all nice and central on the table. So now the plan is, I'm basically just going to make a frame underneath the car and then all the pickup points for the control arms, the upper lower control arms, the steering rack at the front of rear sway bars, the cradle for the rear diff. So you can see in here, there's one point. Another point in here, also need to project up to where the shock tower mount goes, so I need to build a little riser up to that. Coming around the back, same thing really. So there's 3 pickup points, one here, another one here, and another one in there, and then right inside in the middle the bolting up points for the diff centre. It's going to be a fair bit of work. I've got some round bar coming today. Once that turns up, I'll get on the lathe and I'll turn some down. Be the right size to go in all those little mounting locations. And then once that's all bolted in, we can start projecting some steel up to them and get ourselves a nice physical jig. We'll cut back once I've got some billets made up and we'll start getting them in the car and then getting a jig made up. Okay, so I've been jamming away for a few hours here now. Got the cars set it up on the jig nice and good. Been through and I've made a whole heap of these little bosses. So they just go into where all the pickup points for the suspension are. So yeah, you can see 2 at the front. And then I've got a plate up the top there. That's for the shock. And coming around to the rear. So got another one here, another one there, one there, one there, and then you can see up underneath, a bit dark under here, got one at the back there for the diff centre, and then another 2 up the front there. So it might be a bit hard to see some of them up in there through the old camera there, but now that I've got all of them in place, it's just a matter of building some little extensions that come from this frame that I've put in. Some of them will have to be removable, and the car, because you can't just lift the car straight off them, they're going to have to be like a bolt in, bolt out situation, especially the top ones there with the vertical one you've seen. You can't just lift the frame off that, so that's going to have to be a removable one with some pins and stuff to locate it back in its exact spot. So I'll go through and I'll get all that connected up and then we'll cut back. Alright, so I've just made these pieces here up, so they are the mock-up of where the rear shock mounts. See, 2 have got holes cut out and 2 are solid. The 2 solid ones will be the first ones I use now, and then I've got to make another jig up off of that jig so that I can then bolt all the suspension and everything back up to the original frame before I drop the van on top to get the outer measurements of the van. Quite a process. The method there was, I basically just got some bolts, turned them down to a point, threaded them up into the holes, and I got a piece of paper, push that up into those points, held it up with some tape, and then used the dirty finger to get like the circle of the hole. And then I used that one and transferred it to that, scribed some arcs, basically done the old 3-point triangle on this big circle, scribed some arcs, found the centre line of that, and then I had it on the grid paper and basically just measured off that grid and drew it on the computer, and then we ended up with that. So that's worked out pretty good. You see I've got them all tacked together just to match drill them all the same, so when I go put them all together it's identical. Alrighty, well that quick little time lapse you've seen there, basically I've just got to repeat that process another 16 times I think, to all the other pickup points for the suspension and the diff and everything. So I'm not going to film that, it's basically the exact same thing, cut a bit of pipe, notch it, angle, sand, blah blah, tack, tack, tack. Yeah, you sort of see where I'm going. Cut back in a couple of seconds and she'll be all done. Alright, so it's been jamming away here, got a few pipes done in the back end. Just moved on to this one, which seems like a very straight, simple, just straight bit of pipe with a couple of notches in it. But, as simple as it looks, you know, it's just a couple of notches. What we have to do for this one piece is, so that one there is done on the bandsaw, that is a 35-degree cut. I then have my hole saw set at 13 degrees and the pipe, so looking at the end. Alright, well several hours later, that is all the suspension parts done, except for there's one at the very top here, but I've still got to do the diff mounts and everything as well, so it's at a point now where I can safely get the body off the table and then we do those without smashing my head on the car. I've done that a few times, it's not very pleasant. So we'll get the car off and then have a bit of look. Right, with the body off, it's a bit easy to see what I've been playing at here. Yeah, it looks pretty cool. Very happy with that. It came up. I took a few measurements before I took the body off and measured it again and nothing has moved at all, which is darty. See all the pickup points there, they're all happy days. So we've got the one for the shock mounts in the back there. Still got to pick up on these ones, these three here, for the diff. And also you can see up on top here on both sides, another one for a control arm. So I don't know if it's obvious or not, but I am not using these subframes, the front and rear subframe. Sort of why I'm going to all the effort of getting the pickup points for all the control arms. We'll be doing a full one-piece custom chassis the whole way through, front to back of the van. There's some pretty awesome chassis online, some pretty good inspiration out there. Just because I'm pretty bit special in the head, as a lot of people think I'm a bit crazy, but I don't intend on doing a straightforward chassis. I want to do something with a bit of character, a little bit of flair, a bit of style. Something aesthetically pleasing, even though really you'll never see it unless you're doing maintenance on the van and taking the body off. So yeah, we'll carry on, we'll get this centre bit done, and then once that's done we'll take it out, and we'll put the diff centre back in, get the motor back in, set up all the drive shafts and everything, and then we can get the mounts for the gearbox and the little, I don't know what you call it, the little carrier bearing thing in the middle of the drive shafts. It's a two-piece drive shaft, it's got a little thing in the middle there, so we need to locate a mounting point for that as well. So we'll keep ticking on. Alrighty, well, I've just finished up jigging everything off the rear subframe. It's looking like a pretty hectic bit of gear. Sort of pipes and bar and stuff going all over the show. See, I've made this piece here, so that's got the two bolts that pick up the upper control arm, and then I've got these little tabs come off to the other plate for the rear shock. I do need to put all the suspension and everything back in this and then get the van on top of it, so that's part of that jig for putting the suspension back in as well. This one comes down and around to pick up for the sway bar mount, so that's on both sides. And you can see up in there, that's the three bits of pipe picking up for the diff centre. So yeah, pretty stoked with how that's come up. It's looking pretty awesome. Hopefully we'll actually work out how to use a computer and design the chassis. It's got the same sort of flair as this jig has. But yeah, I'm just sort of skipping through this episode. I'm not really doing any time lapse or anything. It's just that first little bit that you're seeing is just cutting, bending, and it just takes time. This has been almost 3 days now. But yeah, we'll get these 3 out of the guts there. We'll get the diff centre back in it, and then we'll drop the engine in, and then we'll be able to start working out all the gearbox mounts. Rightio, well, I have absolutely no idea where I left off filming. Just been jamming away, pumping away at this thing. So you can see I now have a second set of rails in here. That is for jig number 2. So there's 2 jigs here, one for the chassis mounts, and then another jig which is going to hold the front and rear subframes in their correct wheelbase with supports for the front and rear shocks. So now I can separate the 2 jigs, and then I can put all the suspension components, shocks and everything into the second jig and get the van sitting down on top of that, so then that'll give me the space allocation to go out for the sides and how far forward to come to the front for, like, say, a front bumper mount, or I'm going to put a tow hitch in the rear end, so give me a distance to measure back for that, and then put all these other bars back in and start measuring up for the actual chassis itself. So I've opted for a, can you read that there? So I've written it down because I will forget. So all measurements taken off the table will be 280 mils off the table will be 0, say the bottom of the chassis. And then basically every measurement I take will just take 280 mils off, and that'll be from the bottom of the chassis. So when I draw it up in Fusion, the bottom plane will be the bottom of the chassis measurement. If that makes sense. It's not really making sense to me anyway. But sort of how I came to that number from the table is, you can see under here I've just tacked the subframe to this RHS, packed it up there, so that's 285 mils, or 280, sorry. So that's 280 mils off the table, and basically that's sort of the lowest point of the old car, so I'm going to make that the lowest point of my chassis. The bar up the top there for the shocks. Made this one up for the gearbox mount. Now I've only left little holes in there because the holes in the actual mount are about 16 mil, but they only have a 12 mil bolt, so it's going to be a lot easier to measure those up. I haven't bothered jigging up the carrier bearing support there. We'll do that once the chassis is actually made, because things can change a little bit, so that will all get adjusted when the time comes. See, I've got the rear subframe welded. Got that rear subframe welded to these rails. So basically we'll pull everything apart, and these rails, both subframes and the engine and gearbox will come out. I do, however, have to have a bit of a clean up. So I'm just going to get all that stuff bolted back onto the shell, just so it's all in one spot and not spread out everywhere. Obviously at the moment it's all leaning up against the van and that's no good. So we'll get all that bolted back up onto the donor car and then pull the van out and then we'll start stripping this jig down. Rightio, well, had a bit of a change of direction yesterday. Had a guy lined up who's going to come and do a 3D scan of the front and rear subframes so we get some nice accurate measurements on the computer as opposed to my original plan of trying to measure from the table up to these little bosses that I'm putting into the subframes. Didn't turn up, got other commitments so he couldn't actually come, but yeah, sort of got the whole thing stripped out ready, so the motor and everything's gone, but wasn't a total waste of the day. Had a big clean up in the shed, fixed up, done a couple of other little jobs. See, got the holding back together there. So all the steering and sway bar bolts are lining up nice and good. That's all tickety-boo. Same with, oh, you see one in there. It's good. Now we've got threw a bit of paint on. She's a 50-foot paint job, this one. Tell you what, don't ever get me to paint anything for you. I am horrendous at it. My patience for the prep is just not there. You can see. Everything is lining up bloody magic. We'll be getting all 3D scanned so that we can plot all these points into the computer very accurately. A hell of a lot more accurate than I'm going to be able to do measuring off the table, finding angles and all that kind of drama. But for me, having a physical element that once we start actually making the chassis, we've got something that we can physically check it against, as opposed to just designing on a chassis and making it. I don't know, maybe it's a old school dinosaur in me, but I don't trust just designing something on a computer and making it without some kind of jig to back up what you're doing. So yeah, very happy with how that's come up. Everything's lining up spot on. I do still have to do the ones for the diff centre. This secondary jig that I've got in there is in the way of lining those up perfectly, but once we get the motor and the diff and the suspension and everything back into that jig, once we get that in the van and we can measure forward of the wheels, backwards of the wheels, side to side in the van to see where the chassis is going to come out and go. Then we'll get that off, we'll get the subframes off that chassis and chuck it back onto this jig and then I can touch up those ones afterwards. But I'm pretty stoked with how that's come up. Yeah, as always, if you've made it this far in the episode, thank you very much for watching. Next episode will be, I think, will be one on actually the finished design of the chassis. I'm not really going to film any of the design work, so I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe a couple of snippets here and there, a couple of still shots or something, but in the next episode we should have a designed chassis, hopefully signed off by an engineer, ready to fabricate. We'll call it there. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.